We're going to get started on the next section, which is the music talks. And our first speaker is Karli Nave. So if you want to go ahead and start sharing your screen. Reminder for presenters that we're going to be using the chat box to keep track of timing. So make sure you have that up. And if anyone has questions for the presenters, you can use the chat box and we'll give them the questions at the end of their talk.
Okay. I lost my chat box. All right, well, I'm just gonna go ahead and start. So let's see. Okay, hi, so I'm Karli. I am a graduate student working with Dr. Erin Hannon and Dr. Joel Snyder at UNLV. And the work I'm gonna present today is part of my dissertation. So the title of my talk is Subjective Beat Perception Develops Through Adolescence and is related to phonology. So we know that human listeners have what seems to be no trouble picking up on temporal regularities found in music. And this is evidenced by our ability to clap along with music, even if we don't have formal musical training. So we see these sorts of synchronous movements even at a concert. Certainly those abilities to pick up on those temporal regularities help us in other ways. They help us coordinate our movements, such as through dance. And there's even nowadays actually music apps that allow you to synchronize with a particular tempo. You may have even found yourself, sort of finding a particular tempo that you prefer to rock a baby to sleep. So these are sorts of ways that rhythm is all around us and a kind of a part of our environment. But the question I'm really interested in is how these abilities develop. And specifically, the project I'm going to be talking about today is related to the concept of beat. So beat is the periodic pulse that we feel when we listen to music. And we know that adults and children can perceive and entrain their movements to music with a clear beat. But it is worth noting that the amount of error that's allowed to say that a child can do this is actually quite high in research. Typically speaking, children are a lot more erratic in their movements than adults. So I want to just give you a little clip here of my cousin's son dancing to music. And so I want you to see if you think that they are dancing on the beat or not on the beat. So go ahead and take a watch.
Maverick, you dance, dance, dance? Yes, Maverick, you dance?
Okay, so he got a little distracted, but you might have noticed that his movements were actually a bit quicker than the beat, and the mom was actually snapping to the beat, which is a little bit slower. So even though it might seem perceptually like or visually like they are dancing and they've got the rhythm, they're actually quite bad at synchronizing their movement to the beat. And so sort of the question that I'm really interested in is, when do these beat abilities develop, and sort of what's the difference between hearing a deviant versus sort of more complex beat processing abilities, such as maintaining the beat over time and using it to synchronize our movements. So I know we all wanted to watch that again. So we know that adults can self-sustain a beat through a beat ambiguous rhythm. So what I mean by that is they perceive the beat in music and then can continue to perceive that beat even if the evidence underlying the beat isn't so clear. This is similar to what is evidenced in like syncopation, for example. You still know where the beat is even if there's not events falling on the beat. But it's unknown whether or not children can actually sustain a beat. There's not a lot of research in that. I also want to bring up the relation to language. So there's actually a decent amount of work suggesting that beat perception skills are related to children's language abilities, although the results can sort of vary as far as what language components it's related to. And I think that potentially part of the question should be, what ability in beat or in music is this really is sort of explaining this relationship? So it's not necessarily clear from the literature at this point whether or not this relationship is due to general timing abilities, specific rhythm abilities such as beat or meter, or if there's other things playing a role such as cognitive factors. Working memory, for example, is pretty prevalent in like a lot of our beat tasks such as beat discrimination. So in this study, I asked two questions. When do human listeners obtain the ability to maintain an internal perception of the beat? And is this ability related to language? Specifically, we looked at phonology. So in this study, we had 7 age groups. They totaled over 200 participants. We did starting at age 4 all the way through adults. So there's just some demographics here for your information. Generally speaking, our sample is pretty under musically trained in Las Vegas. So we, even as we get to older ages, don't see a ton of music training, but we did have some. So you'll see that sort of represented here. So the overall study design, participants completed a subjective beat task, which I'll explain in a minute. And then they also completed the comprehensive test of phonological processing, known as the CTOP. So we didn't do all the subtests, but we did the 3 that create the phonological composite score, along with one that memory for digits, which we use to sort of capture short-term memory. And so for the subjective beat task, on every trial, there were 3 phases, phase 1, phase 2, and then phase 3, followed by a response. In phase 1, the participants heard a musical excerpt that had one of 2 beat patterns, either a duple beat pattern, which is 3/4 meter, or a triple beat pattern, 6/8 meter. Immediately following this phase, in phase 2, the participants heard what I will refer to as the beat ambiguous rhythm. So crucially, no matter what context they got the same exact stimulus during phase 2. What changes is, at least hypothetically, is how they perceive that stimulus. So whatever beat they heard in the context, we presume they will continue to hear that beat during phase 2. So that's sort of the period that is the sustaining beat phase. Finally, they get this 3rd phase, which is a drum that comes in over top of the music. The music's played on a piano, and you'll hear it in a minute. They have to judge whether the drum is matching or not matching the music. So I'll play an example for you. Go ahead and give me a thumbs up or thumbs down, I guess, or just decide on for yourself if you think it's matching or not matching. Okay, so for those of you who thought it was matching, you're correct. Here is another example. Okay, so that one was not matching. So this is where I usually point out that this task is actually pretty tricky. They have to maintain the beat for quite some time, especially for children. So we actually have another element to this. We have this delay condition. We had a hypothesis that it's possible that children will be able to sustain the beat, but the amount of time they might be able to do that for could vary. So we have this delay condition where the phase 2 can be either 0, 2, 4, or 8 measures long. 0 basically means it just goes directly from the musical context to the probe. So we'll talk about that a little bit more later, but that's sort of an extra element here. Okay, so another thing I want to mention is we actually have sort of a tempo confound. So if we have the same stimulus being played in phase 2 at all times, duple is inherently perceived as being faster than triple because there's 3 strong beats occurring every measure versus 2 in the triple. So we have a tempo manipulation to sort of control for this. So our tempo manipulation, we have a fast tempo and a slow tempo. The fast tempo is 200 millisecond eighth note. So there's 6 eighth notes in a measure here. And for the slow condition, the eighth note is 300 milliseconds. So this creates 4 different inner beat intervals, 2 for duple and 2 for triple. And importantly, I want to point out that we chose these because it creates sort of a matched condition between the 2 beat patterns. So we have the 600 millisecond IBI that occurs in both. We selected this as our match condition because it's roughly around the preferred tempo for human listeners. And so in the duple slow condition, you have the same IBI as you do in the triple fast condition. This allowed us to say if we did see a difference between performance on any of these conditions, we could say whether it was due to tempo or due to beat or a mixture of the 2. So yes, that's the tempo manipulation. So we'll get right into the results. Here we have the basic results for the subjective beat task. And on the x-axis, you're seeing the different age groups. On the y-axis, you're seeing accuracy. And so immediately you see that the youngest 2 age groups are not performing above chance. I'll note that we did have catch trials in this task. So trials where we basically wanted to make sure that they understood how to do the task. And so everyone in this sample actually passed the catch trials. So it's not that they, or at least we're hoping we can say with a little bit more clarity, it's not that they don't understand the task, it's that they are not able to do it. At least they're not performing above chance in our study. But by 8 to 9 years of age, they're performing above chance, and by about 12 years of age, they're actually performing similar to adults. So I'll break this down a little bit further. Now we're looking at same thing on the x-axis, the different age groups, but the y-axis is proportion of matching responses. And the 2 bars are the different trial types. So whether the probe matched or did not match the context phase. So perfect performance, you would have 100% in the black bars and 0% in the gray bars. So a difference between the bars is indicative of good performance here. And here's where we got a trial type by age interaction, where we see basically a significant increase in performance between 6 to 7 years and 8 to 9 years. And then again, between 10, 11 and 12 to 14 years. But then beyond that, there was no significant differences from adults. So we have these sort of 2 phases where it seems like we are seeing increases in this ability that arguably go actually quite late into childhood. There's some research suggesting that beat processing is well developed in kids, but we're showing, at least with this subjective beat perception, that might take a little bit longer to develop. So we also had a significant interaction with tempo, and I'll just point it out here just because I think it's interesting and sort of supports prior work. So basically the interaction is demonstrating this preferred tempo, or at least that's how we're interpreting it. So what I'm doing here is highlighting for you in green the 2 conditions that represent that 600 millisecond IBI, so that tempo that's occurring right around the average preferred tempo for listeners. And you can see that those are the bars that have higher performance. So we're looking at accuracy again here. And the ones in the middle are those 2 that have the 600 millisecond IBI. And as they get older, you're also seeing this kind of pop out a little bit more, where people are doing better at those. So this is sort of what we expected, but it is interesting. It's just sort of backing up that literature. And a bit easier way to look at this is a difference score. So here we're basically taking all the trials that are 600 millisecond IBI and then subtracting from that all the rest of the trials. And so a positive number means that they're doing better on the trials at 600 milliseconds. And that's what we see in all the age groups except the 4 to 5 year olds, which arguably were pretty messy. This task was not for them. Let's just put it that way. Yeah, so I'm just putting this up here briefly, but we didn't actually have any effects of delay. So I remember I mentioned that phase 2 had different lengths. We did not find any effects of delay or interactions with delay. I'm only showing you 8 to 9 and 8 to 9 years of age and up, just for making it a little bit simpler. But the 4 to 5 and 6 to 7 year olds don't look much different from the 8 to 9 year olds. So just briefly, there was no effect of delay. It seems like once they have this ability to do subjective beat perception, they can do it at least up to 8 measures, which was 10 to 14 seconds, depending on the tempo. So now I'll talk about the relation between this task.
Karli, your time is up, so you need to finish up.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Yeah, I can't see the comments. Okay, well, I'll just briefly mention this. So we did a hierarchical regression to look at the relation between beat and phonology. And we did stepwise, where we accounted for age, short-term memory, and then following that, we did music training, which did not account for additional variance. And finally, the beat task accounted for additional variance. So this was pretty cool also, but if you have questions about it, I guess email me and I can talk more about it later. So that's just a summary and that's it. Sorry about that.
Thank you. So if there are questions, you can still write them in the chat to Karli and she can answer them there. But we need to move on to the next talk, which is Ronald Friedman.
Okay, can you all see the, let's see.
Yep.
Okay, great. So let me just make sure I have this working right. Yeah. Okay, so over the years, a number of distinct explanations have been put forth to explain why certain chords, that is combinations of musical tones, tend to be perceived as more consonant, that is more pleasant or stable than others. First, there's evidence that initially neutral or unpleasant sounding chords become more palatable as listeners become more familiarized with them. And that's consistent with evidence of mere exposure effects in other domains of aesthetic judgment. Second, it's been proposed that when musical chords contain partials that tend to stimulate fairly proximal areas of the basilar membrane, it becomes impossible to clearly resolve these constituent partials, leading the chord to be perceived as having a rough timbre. And rougher timbres, rougher chords tend to sound relatively unpleasant. This might reflect the difficulty that the auditory system has in assigning a clear pitch. And as we know from other areas of psychology, disfluency in processing may elicit negative affect. In recent years, the ability of interference-based models to account for consonance has been persuasively challenged. So for instance, in a provocative study, many of you probably know about this one from 2016, a group led by McDermott found that members of the Chimanes, an indigenous Bolivian group with limited exposure to Western music, failed to show preferences between conventionally consonant and dissonant chords. However, they shared Western listeners' aversion to roughness, suggesting that consonance perception is at least not principally due to interference between spectral components. Now, interestingly, whereas McDermott and his colleagues found that preference for normatively consonant chords was unrelated to roughness, they found that it was strongly associated with a predilection for complex tones resembling a harmonic series. So that is in which partials are related by integer multiples. Now, consistent with this work, in a fairly recent paper, back in 2018, Bowling, Purvis, and Gill reported a study in which they had devised a really parsimonious means of estimating the overall harmonicity of a given chord. Again, the extent to which the partials that are present in its component tones collectively produce a harmonic complex sound wave. They then had participants rate the consonants of every possible conventional 2, 3, and 4-note chord that could be constructed within the range of an octave. Across all the chord types, across dyads, triads, and tetrads, participants tended to find relatively harmonic chords more consonant. And this provides converging evidence for the notion that harmonicity fundamentally contributes to the perception of consonance. This is consistent with what they call their vocal similarity hypothesis, the notion that the experience of consonance is in large part based on an evolved preference for sounds that resemble human vocalizations in terms of their harmonic content. Now, upon consideration, Bohling's study all the chord stimuli that they used were generated based on intervals that appear in Western music, or very, very close to those intervals, and to which most of us are therefore really pretty well accustomed. As I mentioned from the outset, it's been empirically established that chords tend to be perceived as more consonant, as more pleasant, as they become more familiar. And so this raises the possibility that Bohling et al.'s recent results may have at least partially resulted from confounding between the harmonicity of the chords that they presented in their study and participants' familiarity with those chords. And so to rule out this confound, we went back and replicated Bohling et al.'s study using chords generated from an unconventional tuning system. It's one many of you may have heard of. This is called the Bohlen-Pierce system. So we actually, used a variant of the Bohlen-Pierce system called the Bohlen-Pierce chromatic just scale. And unlike Western chromatic scales, which divide an octave into 12 intervals, the Bohlen-Pierce chromatic just scale divides a tritave. A tritave is basically the span of an octave plus a perfect fifth. Now you're going to chop that larger span of frequency into 13 intervals based on a series of odd integer frequency ratios, such as 9/7, 9/5, 7/3, and the like. Now, in line with Bohling et al.'s procedure, we presented participants with and asked them to rate the consonants of every possible Bohlen-Pierce chromatic just dyad and triad within the span of a tritave, in this case, instead of an octave. And we also expanded upon their procedure by presenting the chords not just in a piano timbre like they did, but in a clarinet timbre. Get into the nitty-gritty of it. We recruited a participant sample because this was a conceptual replication. It was about 4 times the size of that in the original study, selected from an intro psychology subject pool. Our test stimuli were created from single note piano and bass clarinet samples from a digital archive, which were pitch shifted and combined into chords. And then these were equated for average pitch height and amplitude. Participants were randomly presented with and asked to rate the consonants, the pleasantness of each Bohlen-Pierce dyad and on a 7-point Likert scale. And upon completing 2 blocks of the 13 Bohlen-Pierce dyad ratings, they went ahead and they rated all 78 Bohlen-Pierce triads in 2 consecutive blocks. Okay. Now, before I go on, I just want to say at least a few words about the Bohling harmonicity computation. So this involves finding the greatest common divisor of the fundamental frequencies of the tones. Here's an example. And you then determine the complete harmonic series beginning on that greatest common divisor and assigning the highest frequency in this series to the least common multiple of the fundamentals of the chord tones. And then finally, you calculate the percentage of harmonics in this complete series that are actually present in the complex spectrum that's produced by this chord. And so a higher overlap between this and this, that is, higher overlap signifies greater harmonic similarity. Okay? So what did we find? Well, at first, we found nothing. There was no reliable correlation between harmonicity and consonance in either dyads or triads. We really failed to replicate this major study. So to dig a little deeper and kind of cast a wider net for the effect, we conducted a wide variety of analyses using various post hoc exclusions. So for instance, if you exclude triads outside of the range of harmonicity typical of Western chords, then you do find that there's a positive association between harmonicity and consonance for chords in both a piano and a clarinet timbre. So focusing on the black dots here, okay? Bowl Pierce, again, they tend to be relatively unharmonic compared to Western chords. Still, as you might be thinking, and as much as these results are based on post hoc exclusions, they didn't inspire a whole lot of confidence. And so in deciding how to proceed, we wondered whether flaws in Bowling's original harmonicity metric, and again, it's a simple, it's a very interesting metric, but kind of, back of the envelope metric. And there may have been aspects that might have undermined their ability to cleanly detect an association between harmonicity and consonance within this unconventional tuning system. And so, for instance, the Bowling metric ignores the likely possibility that the auditory system treats very slight deviations from specific frequency ratios identically. However, if you change the frequency ratios even a hair using their metric, then this can result in substantially altered harmonicity estimates. Second, it doesn't take into account that the auditory system might treat frequencies an octave apart as equivalent. So for instance, different inversions of a major triad are modeled in Bowling's metric as having very different harmonicities, whereas the brain, because of octave equivalence, may in fact process these types of chords much more similarly. Frankly, given our reading the literature before we had done this study, we were also, or at least I was, pretty stunned by recent contributions from computational musicologists, say in Marcus Pierce's lab at Harrison and Pierce, in the Parncut lab, in Erola's lab, who had concluded from both behavioral and corpus analyses that researchers in recent years had prematurely written off what may be in fact a substantial contribution of spectral interference to consonance ratings. And so in light of this, we went back, we reran, we kind of went beyond a simple replication. We reran our computations for Bowl-Pierce chords using recently developed information theoretical models of harmonicity. And the main thing you want to know about those is that they overcome the shortfalls of Bowling's metric. So, unlike Bowling, who didn't bother to address roughness, because again, just assumed on theoretical grounds and recent empirical findings, there was nothing going on. We included this classic measure of spectral interference in musical chords. Now, interestingly, when you move beyond these pre-existing assumptions and actually run the numbers, not only these are just the results of regression analyses, not only does spectral interference shown in the red bars here contribute to consonance judgments, but it actually accounts for more variance than does harmonicity, okay, shown in the blue bars, even when this is gauged using a more sophisticated metric than Bowling's. Now, I want to mention, I'm showing effects here collapsed across timbre. When you look at effects in the piano timbre alone, the effects are reliable for harmonicity. So whereas this doesn't invalidate the importance of harmonicity, it certainly suggests that Bolling's conclusions regarding the central role of this variable were overstated, and if anything, supports a composite model of consonance. It's something that's been emerging from various labs in the last year or so. One that takes into account harmonicity, yes, but also very much takes into account spectral interference, and ultimately has to take into account familiarity to explain judgments of the consonants of isolated chords. Now, to bolster confidence in our conclusions regarding the surprisingly robust contribution of spectral interference to consonance ratings, we recently ran 2 follow-up studies. This is very fresh data in which we collected ratings of Bohlen-Pierce dyads presented either dyadically as before, which is, to my knowledge, something that's been the case in 99% of studies over the last century, or dichotically. Okay, now presumably dichotic presentation wouldn't allow for physical interference of partials on the basilar membrane, and so that should substantially diminish the correlation between spectral interference and consonance. However,
Ron, your time is also up.
Oh, my time is up?
Yep.
Okay, so let me just, sorry, I didn't even see. Okay, hold on. I'll just try to wrap up in here really quickly. I'm sorry about that. Oh, I see. Okay, 1 minute left, you're telling me. So just the bottom line, we basically found that the correlation was essentially the same, regardless of whether you had dyadic or dichotic presentation. And so at this point, I really can't explain the result, and I would very much welcome your feedback on this. There are a variety of possibilities. Again, now I've run out of time, I can't go through them, but one of the possibilities that there is actually central processing of interference as opposed to peripheral that might be contributing to these types of consonance judgments. If it's not about roughness, maybe it's about central masking, or maybe there's some sort of generalized kind of stimulus generalization learning going on. But again, it's mysterious to me at this point why a measure of roughness that was supposed to model interference on the basilar membrane is still predicting consonance even with dichotic presentation. And I'll leave it off there, and I apologize for going over. I didn't see the chat.
Great, thank you. So you'll see there's a question from Laurie Heller in the chat. So if you respond to her there while we get the next speaker ready.
Okay, we'll do that. I apologize.
Yep, thank you.
Sorry, one moment.
Yep, our next speaker is Cameron Anderson.
I'm just going to make sure that I'm sharing some sound. Perfect. Okay, hi everybody. My name is Cam, and I study how acoustic cues in music affect our perception of emotion at McMaster's Maple Lab. In this talk, I'll briefly summarize some of the psychological literature exploring emotion expression in music, and I'll try to contextualize this in some findings from historical musicology, looking at changes in music's cues over time. And hopefully for more a broad perceptual message, I want to wrap this up in a discussion of how stimulus selection can be really powerful when combined with the right hypothesis. So one fundamental question that perceptual psychologists have to ask themselves is, how real should your stimuli be? And so we can imagine on a scale where on one end of the scale we have the most externally valid stimulus. That's a stimulus that's very easy to perceive in nature. It's something that you would hear naturally, but something that's very difficult to measure and difficult to control. And on the other end of the scale, you'll have something that's highly internally valid. The effects are very clear. However, it's hard to relate to real world listening experiences. And so it's a trade-off between, and I'll call these natural and controlled approaches to music emotion research. And so for an example of an externally valid stimulus, you might have a piano performance, which sounds like this. And for a more controlled approach, you might have a MIDI excerpt of a simple melody that sounds like this. Okay. And so most of the music emotion literature uses somewhere in between these two approaches, or they choose one or the other. And a lot of the controlled approaches will use a melody like the one we just heard. This is in the major mode. They'll present that to participants, and then they'll also present some variants. For instance, one that might be in the minor mode and would sound like this. Okay. So if you're unfamiliar with the term mode, in a very simplistic explanation, I'd say it's a organizational structure which helps to distinguish music's sort of emotional atmosphere. And so you might think of the major mode by relating it to Happy Birthday and the minor mode to Stairway to Heaven. And so a lot of findings which have used somewhere in between controlled and naturalistic stimuli usually find something like this, where pieces that are both fast and in a major key tend to be rated highest in perceived happiness, whereas pieces that are slow and in a minor key are rated highest in perceived sadness or lowest in perceived happiness. And you'll find some intermixings that are intermediate somewhere in between. And so this controlled approach offers a very powerful way of exploring musical stimuli and the effects of individual cues on emotion perception. However, not all hypotheses can be explored using such controlled approaches. For example, how music's acoustic cues have changed over time. And so to highlight some of the differences between how music might have sounded to Romantic era ears versus Baroque era ears, we can actually look at an artwork of performers from both representative eras here. You see that the art style is different. There's a lot of aesthetic differences, but perhaps more importantly, you can see that there's acoustic differences too. For example, both performers are using different instruments. And in the Romantic era, there are pretty important innovations like the extended keyboard, as well as a sustain pedal. And even differences in the way that philosophers discussed emotion. And so some empirical musicology studies looking at how these cues have changed over time have found interesting differences across musical eras. For instance, one study by Caitlin Horn and David Huron looked at music composed between the years 1750 and 1900 and analyzed a number of different cues, including mode and timing, as well as how loud or soft the music was, and whether the notes were connected smoothly, legato, or disconnected, staccato. And you'll see some interesting changes in the prevalence. So just to name a few, this first category here that they analyzed doubled in its prevalence between 1750 to 1790 and 1850 to 1890, whereas the second category almost completely disappeared here. And so other studies too have found this distinction between acoustic relations in music as it's changed across musical eras. And so this was the inspiration for our current study, where we wanted to explore how people perceive emotion in prelude sets by Bach and Chopin. These sets were prelude sets. They're ideal because they're balanced in terms of mode. So there's an equal number of major pieces and minor pieces. Participants rated emotion along Russell's two-dimensional circumplex model, which distinguishes music into emotion into two orthogonal components, one being valence. So a low valence would be negative in emotional character, whereas a high valence would be something that's positive in emotional character. Arousal roughly corresponds to a piece's perceived intensity, or an emotion's perceived intensity rather, where 1 would be very subdued and 100 would be very intense. And so we can then visualize these in two-dimensional space to explore how they relate to each other. And if we kind of overplot silly emojis on top, we can find exemplar emotions that would fall somewhere along the scale. For instance, that's something that's high in arousal and high in valence. So positive and intense would be an emotion like happiness, where something that's low in both dimensions, so subdued and negative, would be something like sadness. In contrast, something that's high in arousal but low in valence, so negative but intense, would be something like anger, where something that's high in valence, positive but low in arousal, would be something like calm. And so we can see how participants rated individual pieces from the sets by visualizing them in this way, where we have arousal on the y-axis and valence on the x-axis. You can ignore the letters here. All I want you to focus on is the differences between minor pieces, which are in blue, and major pieces, which are in this pink color. And you can see that for both composers, the pieces are clearly bifurcated along the valence dimension, where major pieces are generally perceived as happy and minor pieces are generally perceived as sad. However, for Chopin, you see a more nuanced mix of emotions where he's accessing both sides of the arousal dimension for both major and minor pieces, whereas we see a more linear trend here. So you would expect for Bach a sort of disconnect between minor being sad sounding and major being happy sounding, whereas for Chopin, we see more nuanced emotions. And so next we wanted to compare how different cues individually or jointly predict emotion responses using a technique called commonality analysis. Commonality analysis is somewhat complex, but essentially it helps us to distinguish a cue's unique effect from its joint effect with other cues. So how this works is you can imagine that if each cue was a circle, there'd be some overlap in their effect. So by taking the commonalities between cues, we can see then how the intercorrelations of cues, how their intercorrelated structure is affecting emotion responses while factoring out their unique effects. So ignoring what mode is doing alone here, we can look at what mode is doing with attack rate. Similarly, while ignoring mode and its intercorrelations with attack rate and pitch height, we can look at what all three cues are doing together and see how the individual contributions of cues or their intercorrelations with other cues when controlling out their individual contributions is affecting the way people are perceiving emotion in the music. And so to kind of highlight the strength of this approach, we could imagine valence just ignoring the intercorrelations. And we see that for both composers, we see that mode is predicting valence most strongly, suggesting that mode is accounting for whether participants are perceiving happy or sad emotions in music. But when we look under the hood, we can see more nuanced dynamics going on, where most of the variance in valence ratings that's being predicted by mode is actually because of mode's shared contribution with attack rate. So you can see here that this rectangle is the same as this rectangle, because this is how the cues are correlated when factoring out their individual contributions. Whereas for Chopin, what we see is primarily mode's unique contribution is affecting valence ratings, along with its intercorrelation with pitch height. Similarly, for attack rate, we can see for arousal ratings, the intensity of the perceived emotion, we can see that attack rate is predicting most of the variance in valence ratings for both composers. But when we look deeper, we can see that for Bach, primarily attack rate's unique component is predicting arousal ratings, along with its joint contributions with mode and pitch height. But for Chopin, primarily, it's attack rate's unique component alone that's doing most of the work. And so with this research, we see that when we ignore the individual and joint contributions, what we find is broadly consistent effects with the music emotion literature. Primarily, mode predicts valence, whether people are perceiving happy or sad emotions, and attack rate is accounting for most of the variance in arousal rating, so the intensity of the emotional response. But when we decompose the variance, we see more nuanced dynamics. Like we saw for Bach, while mode was attributing most of the variance in valence ratings for Bach, we saw that that was largely due to its correlation with attack rate, or the timing aspect of music. And so hopefully here I was able to demonstrate how by combining a historically informed hypothesis and the selection of naturalistic stimuli, we were able to explore familiar questions in a sort of more nuanced way. So lastly, I'd like to thank my lab mates, and I would be happy to receive your questions at my email here. And I think.
Yep. Thank you. We also have about 3 minutes left, so if there are questions for Cam now, you can write them in the chat.
Thank you. And if you can't think of any questions to ask right now, but you think of one later, feel free to email me because I'd be happy to answer them.
All right, thank you very much.
Great, thank you.
Our next speaker is going to be Barbara Nerness.
Hi, everyone. I'm Barbara Nerness, and I'm going to be presenting today on neural alpha oscillations during turn-taking piano duet, index creative thinking, and engagement to the partner's action. And I'm a PhD candidate at Stanford working with Takako in her lab. And so let me just full screen that. So to start some background, joint action requires anticipation of others' future actions to coordinate your own movement, as well as shared representations of a goal. And musical improvisation in an ensemble requires real-time planning, execution of actions, and adaptation of musical goals, which provides a unique lens to study joint action in a creative task. So we looked at EEG correlate of alpha oscillations, which are the 8 to 13 hertz frequency band in scalp recorded EEG signal. And these are classified by location and functionality and are related to attention and memory processing. So in alpha oscillations and other oscillations as well, we see event-related desynchronization before movement, which is suppression of oscillatory power compared to baseline. And alpha ERD is associated with movement and sensory stimulus processing. So on the right, we see from Firstscheller et al.'s 1996 study, movement happened at time 0 and around 2.5 seconds beforehand. There is a reduction in both alpha and also beta power here. And then event-related synchronization is a power increase. So that's associated with rebound after the ERD or processing for repeating stimuli. So the 2 seconds after the movement, there's this increase in alpha power. And so when we look at this in different tasks, alpha, ERD, and ERS occurs when you're just imagining or observing a familiar task. And larger mu ERD during both execution and observation has been correlated with higher scores of perspective taking, which is a part of cognitive empathy. And in music improvisation, alpha power is positively related to the amount of creative ideation in a task or inwardly directed attention. And improv elicits a right parietal ERD in musicians, but not non-musicians. And musicians show greater ERS when they're improvising than reading a score if they have improv training, but not otherwise. So taking this together, we designed our study to use a simultaneous dual EEG recording and a turn-taking task to investigate this alpha ERD and ERS in a piano duet. So as you can see in the diagram on the right, pianists sat across from each other in the same sound isolated recording booth, and they can hear each other through loudspeakers, and we instructed participants to only use their right hand. And we explored 3 factors. So the first was melody. Pianists either played the score or improvised, which I'll explain more on the next slide. And the second factor was task similarity. So whether both players were in the same melodic condition. If they're both playing the score or both improvising, we refer to that as we. And if one player improvised and the other played the score, that is what we called me. And then the third factor is the role. So the starting player is the leader, and the joining player we call the follower. And you'll see more of that on the next slide too. So we collected data from 24 pianists. They weren't specifically trained in jazz or improvisation, and had an average of 14 years of piano training. So I'm going to walk you through the task setup. To begin, one player is assigned to be the leader. The other person is the follower. And players traded roles so that each person was the leader half the time and the follower half the time. And the leader would play this top row, and the follower would play the bottom row, and then the computer was playing a bass line for all trials to provide a tonal center, which is especially important for the improv condition. So, for example, like when the leader and follower are playing the score, we called that we score. And the leader would begin with playing phrase 1 and the follower is just listening. And in the second phrase, the leader is listening and the follower is playing the score, and so on. So in the condition where the one person, so the leader, improvises and the follower plays the score, that would look like this. And during improv, players were instructed to play the exact same rhythm, but they can choose any note. And in the first phrase, the leader would improvise and the follower is playing the score, or sorry, the follower is listening and preparing to play the score in the next phrase. And the leader is improvising in the first phrase and then listening in the second phrase. And then this repeats in the next two. And if the leader plays the score and the follower improvises, we have something like this. And then you can imagine what it looks like if both players improvise. So in total, each pianist experienced all combinations of similarity and melody and role. So for this study, we were focusing in on these listening phrases into the second and third phrase, shown here, which we chose because of the task similarity before and after for the leader and follower. And we think of these phrases as like a auditory perception task where each player is preparing for their next part, whether that's the score or the improv, as well as listening. So our hypothesis were that when you're listening to a partner play, the sensory processing of an improvisation requires more neural resources than a familiar melody, which could lead to stronger ERD. And task similarity, we just thought might modulate this alpha ERD and ERS somehow. But since improv is a more creative task than playing the score, there may be an interaction between the similarity and melody condition. So here is what we found. On the left, we have electrode groups. So we split our data into 3 different groups. Fronto-central, which is in orange here, central-parietal left, and central-parietal right. And on the plots, the score is in red, and the improv is in blue. And our top row is the leader in phrase 2, who's listening to the follower. And the bottom row, we have the follower who's listening to the leader. So the general shape that we can see is kind of this hill. We're going up, which is the ERS rebound after movement from playing. And then this peaks roughly halfway through the phrase and then goes down, which is an ERD in preparation for playing in the next phrase. So there was a significant main effect for melody, which could be score or improv. And this difference was most apparent when the task is the same between partners, which is this left column of data here where similarity is we. And for these conditions, we can see there's much more ERS for score, especially for the leader shown in red, than the follower. Sorry, they both have a lot of ERS in the leader and follower, but more than improv. And it suggests that the leader who's listening to the score and preparing to play the score is the easiest condition here. Whereas the follower who's listening to improv, shown in blue, and contemplating their own improv coming up, is the most cognitively loaded condition, requires the most neural resources. And on the right, we have the me conditions, where one player is improvising and the other is playing the score. And when the leader is listening to improv, in blue here, they are preparing to play the score, and the shape looks like the we score over here in red. And that is slightly reduced over here, but it could be because they're listening to a new melody. They're listening to an improv in their partner, which takes a little more processing than if it was the familiar score. And then when the leader is listening to the score in red here, they are preparing to improv, and that is reducing their ERS. For the follower, score and improv are pretty close, but listening to improv still elicits more ERS than listening to the score, just like in the leader above. So overall, this means that one's own melodic condition, so whether you're playing improv or playing the score, is going to determine the general shape of the alpha power. And we also had a significant two-way interaction for melody and similarity. And what's interesting is that we improv, so this blue one here is where both players must encode their new melody and from their partner and create an idea for what to play next. And this is the only condition with an ERD, perhaps because the task is most difficult. And for me improv, up here, when the player is preparing to play the score, they have more ERS, perhaps than playing the score here, perhaps because listening to improv is not so demanding when you know you're only going to play the score after that. And yeah, so in conclusion, we are interpreting this in terms of neural resources, and overall found that listening to your partner play results in ERS and a little bit of ERD, but mostly ERS compared to baseline. And ERS is consistent with this rebound after termination of movement from playing. And we see a greater ERS for the score compared to improv. And we interpret this as during a piano duet, partners don't need as many neural resources if they're listening to some familiar material, such as the score, rather than improv. And if both players are improvising, then they're in this, they're exchanging musical ideas, and the ERS reduction could indicate higher levels of engagement and empathy between players. And lastly, this interaction that we see, we could say that task creativity and the amount of the shared goal modulate neural resources in musical partners when they're listening to each other. So that is it. Thanks for listening, and I guess put any questions in the chat.
Thank you, Barbara. We have a question from Carolyn Palmer, who says, how similar was the improvised pitch content to the scored pitches in the other part, any relation to the EEG activity?
Yeah, we are, another student is analyzing the pitch kind of contours in relation to their, how close they are to the actual score that we gave. And we don't have that data yet, but yeah, they're pretty similar, but not all of them are correlated, are exactly the same as the score. So some people tended to have more unique improvisations than others. But yeah, I don't have clear, an exact answer yet. And then I guess there's another question. So I guess the one from Peter, it's about whether the score is retrieved from memory or we're reading from notation. And in this case, the score was pretty easy. So people had it memorized very quickly. And it could be interesting to look at, sight reading versus a memorized score. But yeah, we didn't have that option in ours.
Great, thank you. If there are more questions, you can send them directly to Barbara, and we will move on to our last talk for this session, which is Emma Greenspon.
All right. Thank you very much. So the title of my talk today is looking at the disruptive effective phonatory interference on vocal imitation of pitch. So the purpose of this research was really to try and better understand some of the processes involved in vocal imitation of pitch, or more generally speaking, singing. So in order to reproduce a pitch with your voice, you're going to need a accurate perceptual representation of that pitch, as well as a well-developed plan for the vocal system in order to actually produce that pitch. So one mechanism that might be underlying sensory motor integration has been proposed to be auditory imagery. This comes from findings that auditory imagery is capable of representing both perceptual and motor information. And so by this logic, we might expect that inaccurate singers would also experience degraded auditory imagery. And that has been found previously through previous research, like I show you in the graph below, in which less accurate singers tend to report experiencing less vivid auditory images. Auditory imagery, as I mentioned, also is related to motor processes as well. And so this suggests that motor processes related to the vocal system, like the inner voice, may be important for auditory imagery tasks. So previous work has also shown that interfering with the inner voice through things like phonatory interference or articulatory interference tend to also disrupt performance on auditory imagery tasks, suggesting that auditory imagery may also be associated with subvocalization. And more recently, work by my collaborators, Pruitt et al., found that individuals who actually were imagining a melody before singing the melody were engaging muscles of the vocal system, suggesting that individuals engage in subvocalization during this preparatory imagery before singing. So given this prior work, the current research was interested in understanding, well, how important is subvocalization for singing accuracy? So the way that we addressed this question was essentially through a knockout approach, where we tried to interfere with subvocalization using a variety of tasks, which I'll describe in more detail in just a few slides. And so we use these vocal motor secondary tasks during an imagery phase to see whether interfering with subvocalization also interfered with performance. So in the current study, we had 42 undergraduate students from the University at Buffalo participate. These were on average non-musicians, though we did have a range of musical experience. Before completing the study, we actually had a pre-screening in which participants came into the lab and completed the Seattle Singing Accuracy Protocol in order to gain a measure of singing ability. This protocol also includes an adaptive pitch discrimination task. And so participants in the final sample all had a pitch discrimination threshold of below 100 cents. Then for the main experiment, what we did is we presented participants with 4 novel melodies, all presented in a major key. Participants were then asked to imagine the melody, and then were asked to sing the melody. So this really reflects our control condition, which was always presented first within the experiment. Then, as I mentioned before, we also have these vocal motor secondary tasks. So for this secondary tasks, we included a condition with articulatory interference, where participants were asked to just silently repeat or mouth the syllables ba, ta during this imagery phase. We also had another secondary task, which was phonatory interference. This is where participants were asked to quietly hum a comfortable pitch during that imagery phase. And then the third secondary task we had was the phonatory suppression. This was designed to try and inhibit but not interfere with subvocalization by having participants exhale continuously during this imagery phase. So trials were blocked by condition, and the control condition was always presented first, but then the 3 secondary tasks were counterbalanced across participants. So in order to measure muscle activity related to subvocalization for this task as well, we also use surface electromyography, where we place these sensors on top of some specific muscle groups involved in the vocal system, such as the left and right upper lip and the right and left sternohyoid muscle. So what I'm showing you in this figure here is the SEMG activity for each sensor. We also had the bicep as our kind of control sensor as well. We wouldn't expect activity in the bicep to be related to the task. So then we measured this activity within the imagery phase. When participants were asked to actually imagine that melody, we were interested in the degree of muscle activity at those different sensor sites during that imagery phase. So this allowed us to look at what muscle activity was associated with each of those secondary tasks. Okay, and again, this is all being measured within the imagery phase when participants are only imagining the melody, not when they were actually singing or listening. All right, so we assessed pitch imitation accuracy by first calculating absolute pitch deviations between the pitch the participant sang, which I'm illustrating in this graphic as that red line, and the target pitch, which is shown as the blue line. So that center blue line would be the target pitch, and then the line above and below would mark the 50-cent boundary surrounding that target pitch. So any sung pitch that was outside of that 50-cent boundary was coded as an inaccurate production or an error. And so trials within that boundary were coded as correct, whereas this note trials, notes outside of that boundary were coded as incorrect. Okay, so then we also looked, this gave us a measure of pitch errors. So the main questions we had in the study were, what function might subvocalization serve for poor pitch imitators? So if subvocalization is actually supportive, we'd expect subvocal interference to disrupt performance. And if this type of vocalization is specific to phonation, we'd expect that phonatory interference would be the most disruptive. So what I'm showing you here are the error rates for each condition. We had the control task, the phonatory interference task, the exhale condition or phonatory suppression, and our articulatory interference condition. We found a significant difference only between the phonatory condition and the control condition, whereas the other two secondary tasks, exhale and articulatory interference, did not significantly differ from the control condition. Given this difference between phonatory interference or performance during phonatory interference and performance in the control condition, we were interested in how the degree of disruption by phonatory interference related to participants' overall singing ability. So again, we had that pre-screening task where we had a measure of singing ability that was unrelated to the current experiment. And so we were interested in whether there was a relationship between how disruptive phonatory interference is relative to the control with respect, and whether that related to overall singing ability. So we took a different score looking at phonatory interference minus control, looking at error rates and determining whether that was related to error rates in that pre-screening task. What we found was a positive correlation such that individuals that had higher error rates in the screening, so they were less accurate, tended to also be more disrupted by the phonatory interference. However, no other different scores were related to performance in that screening task, the pitch imitation screening task. All right, so since we did not find articulatory interference as disruptive relative to the control, we wanted to make sure that participants were actually engaging in that secondary task. So for articulatory interference, that's when they were silently mouthing the syllables ba, ta. So in order to determine whether participants were actually engaging muscle activity specific to that interference condition, we did have the SEMG measures to look at muscle activation as well. What we found is that even though we didn't find this difference between performance under articulatory interference and control, participants were in fact engaging in articulatory processes. So they were moving their lips as expected, even though that did not disrupt performance. We were able to verify that by looking at the SEMG measure. Okay, so from these results, what we suggest is that because interfering with subvocalization did disrupt performance, subvocalization may have a supportive role for singing accuracy. And this comes from our findings specifically that phonatory interference, interfering with subvocal processes related to phonation rather than articulation, for example, disrupted pitch imitation performance the most. We also find that the reliance on subvocalization may vary by ability, such that inaccurate imitators tended to be the most disrupted by phonatory interference compared to the accurate imitators. Okay, so I just wanted to acknowledge my collaborators as well as the undergraduate research assistants that helped with this research as well. Any questions that I can't get to during this time, you can email me as well with the address that I show here. And I'm open to questions at this time.
Thanks, Emma. We have One question coming from Tim Hubbard. He says, in the imagery control condition, were participants instructed to imagine hearing the melody or instructed to imagine performing the melody, and would that make a difference?
Yeah, that's interesting. I believe in the previous research with Brodsky et al., they didn't find differences in terms of just listening, but when participants listened to a melody, but they did find differences when participants were imagining the melody, suggesting that there could be maybe some differences between what the intention is. Participants were asked to, I'd have to check the exact phrasing of the instructions, but I believe participants were asked to just imagine the melody without a specific instruction to imagine playing the melody or imagine singing the melody in your head.
Yeah, I think Leah Fostick's question is similar about imagery vocalization before playing an instrument, and would that be the same thing, or is it specifically about singing it?
Oh, sorry, I was getting distracted by Peter's follow-up question. So the vocalist, so is it specific to singing versus would it generalize to another instrument? I believe the sub-vocalization, the inner voice would be recruited during the imagery phase, whether or not the, I guess if we say vocalization, then I would assume that we're using the inner voice, in which case the sub-vocalization would be important. I guess I'm looking for maybe clarification on the question, because if I believe the inner voice would be used even if, say, the timbre, the instrument being presented was different. If that makes sense. I might be misinterpreting the question. Okay.
She said thanks. All right, so well, there's one more question here. A lot of orchestras are practicing on Zoom due to the pandemic. Do you think this medium will affect melody imitation and harmony across voices? It's a good question. Is it the same over Zoom as it would be in person?
Practice. Oh, well, I mean, the challenge with Zoom, I guess, could be with delayed feedback, which would kind of get into a different ball game, so much as the sub-vocalization aspect. Within the context of this research question, it's more kind of these preparatory processes before you perform. I believe that within more group settings, then you kind of throw in the feedback role there as well, which kind of gets into some other different and interesting questions as well.
All right, thank you, Emma, and thank you everyone during the music talk session. So that's the end of our morning session. The poster session is the next thing. So poster presenters will be at their posters, odd number posters from 11:30 to 12:15, and even number posters from 12:15 to 1. And then we welcome you to come back on this Zoom meeting for the afternoon session, which starts at 1:30 with Ed Golub's keynote address.